I'm very pleased to have here in the studio with me Alan Minsky. He's the program director at KPFK, Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, so we're pleased to be on the air. He's also the son of the celebrated economist Hyman Minsky, and there is a conference put on, is this the Levy Institute?
The Levy Institute, correct.
LEVYinstitute.org, here in Washington, D.C. Tell us about it, Alan.
Well, it's a conference they put on every year. My father was a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and when he retired, he moved over to the Levy Institute, which is sort of an economic think tank. Would be associated as a politically progressive economic think tank, but they really are a serious macroeconomic think tank. Most of the work is done in loosely the Keynesian tradition, but, you know, there's some radical economists, there's some less radical Keynesians who've been associated, but they really follow macroeconomic financial regulation. My father was a very peculiar left progressive economist in that he focused upon the role of banking. And he had a particular theory that he was famous for called the financial instability hypothesis, that the briefest summary of which is stability is destabilizing in financial markets, and basically that the compulsion when you have a stable market for people to take excessive risks is excessive, and without regulation and some kind of adult oversight, these things lead to bubbles and then they burst. Well, my father was somebody who was in the Keynesian tradition, and if you look at Keynes and the general theory, his great theoretical work, it has sections on banking. Well, my father looked at those and expanded upon those. And of course, what we've seen in the global economy and in the American economy is the role of finance has increased exponentially over the most recent decades. And so within the Keynesian framework, my dad's theories about the role of finance and banking have now become the subject of much study and focus around the world.
And maybe we are setting ourselves up by the great deregulations, right? I mean, you know, not Herbert Hoover, but who was elected in 1920? It was Harding. Warren Harding.
Right.
Warren Harding was the great deregulator. I mean, he ran on a platform literally of more business in government, less government in business. In other words, deregulate and privatize. And that led right to the crash of 20. And then we got this massive deregulation at the end of the Clinton presidency in 99 and 2000 with these bills put forward by the Republicans, particularly Phil Gramm, that deregulated the banks. And now, so, you know, the crash of 2016 on its way?
Well, could be prescient. But the keynote speaker that was just speaking at the conference was Senator Elizabeth Warren. Of course, it was a very high political drama to have Senator Warren, of course, now one of the central figures in American politics.
So what did she say to you guys this morning?
Well, it was.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't
very focused and distinct and very powerful, and this was right in her wheelhouse. I mean, she talked about the need for the strengthening of the consumer protection. Of course, was what she was originally brought to Washington to work on by President Obama, the need for that, what its successes has been. But then she talked straight up about regulation and the various realms in which regulation needs to be strengthened. And she said straight up that, regulation is a friend of markets, that the GOP is pursuing a radical anti-market agenda. Because when you don't have rules, when you don't have regulation, you encourage cheating. And when you have cheating, you have deformed markets.
Right. And use to explain that to people who don't get it,
right,
is they say, well, I want free markets, right? I want free trade, I want free whatever. And my response is, would you ever want to play in a free football game?
Yeah, there we go. Right, sure.
Whichever team has the most money gets to pick where the goalpost is going to be,
which is where it is. And at the end, boy, did she hit on that. She said this is an economic problem and this is a political problem.
Right.
And she cited an instance where Citibank put some rider into a bill that would have was going to shut down the government, and Jamie Dimon was on the phone to the politicians themselves before the vote, and who is going to get their calls answered,
right,
by Congress people other than somebody with that kind of power, that kind of money. But she went through it bit by bit, and I have to say, obviously one of the big issues politically in the country has been is will Elizabeth Warren be running for president? And certainly on this subject, her charisma. And this is a group of professional economists, and they were exhilarated by her performance. It was a speech, and this is again on her wheelhouse. And on this subject, you could not have a more powerful champion of the American people on where the field is today institutionally. And by the way, she called for institutional structures, but it changes, by which she meant the banks are too big. You have to directly address the fact that we have 11 financial institutions in this country that if any one of the 11 were to collapse, they would bring down the economy as what happened in 2008. And she said simply, and again, the way the government is dealing with this, the regulators are not on the beat effectively. She said the Fed has to be more on top of regulating the banks. They slap them on the hand once, they go out and they cheat again, they slap them on the hand again, and they're never punished. The SEC and the DOJ are also too lax. So she went through all of that. But she also said she was very adamant that the banks are too big, the banks have to be broken up. And so she's calling for regulation, but not the type of like every nook and cranny has to be regulated, which has to be the cause when you have 11 massive. But if you break up the banks, then you have, less line-by-line detail, 1,000 pages of regulation. They're tighter, they're simpler, they're more streamlined as well. So she was, it's the type of thing that I think the average citizen would hear and would really be swayed by. And
if you break up the big banks, if you break up these banking, essentially monopolies, competition, I don't want to sound like a libertarian or a Friedmanite, but competition does introduce a level of its own kind of natural systems regulation.
Right.
So, because you're going to have competitors saying he's not playing by the rules.
Right.
They're going to be calling each other, things like that. So.
Yeah. This has to be an integrated system that works well. The regulators have to be seen as the allies of the honest players in the marketplace.
Right. And right now, you've got a bunch of banks that hate the regulators. They're doing everything they can to do away with the regulations. They're buying politicians like there's no tomorrow. This is a very seriously bad situation. As a person who really understands economics, we're talking with Alan Minsky, by the way, a program director at KPFK in Pacifica, son of the celebrated economist Hyman Minsky, and he just came from, and I think you're going to go back to a gig that you guys are doing today at the Levy Institute. Levy-institute.org is the website where Elizabeth Warren just spoke, and it's a lot of this is all about the work that your dad did. What are your thoughts on the U.S. and the world economy right now?
Well, I'll answer that, but I want to say something because I think this is I come to this interview with one very important point, which I think you'll love, Tom, which is that I really think in the United States right now we effectively have 4 branches of government. The Constitution is written as 3rd, but when you look, and this relates to the global economy and the American economy, when you look at the institutions of the American government, obviously there's a judiciary, executive, congressional, and the truth is nothing is more significant and powerful right now than. Why is that? Because the GOP has basically blocked any fiscal remedies on the economy, and therefore the only institution that can operate to make significant macroeconomic shifts in the economy is the Fed. And I do think when you have Janet Yellen as opposed to Bernanke, who was better than Greenspan, but by the time you get to Yellen and away from Greenspan, you do have someone who does consider the welfare of working people. And I think this is important. When people talk about who will put in the next Supreme Court justice. And I'm not here to give talking points to the Democratic Party, but I think people should recognize that, Yellen is an appointee by Obama who would not have been appointed by a Republican, and that's very significant.
Yeah, and Greenspan, the Republican appointee, was the guy who basically took the whole thing down.
Yeah,
right. It's like Greenspan and his. He was so in love with Ayn Rand, he took a $6-foot dollar bill floral arrangement to her funeral, and he was initiated into her cult in her apartment in New York City.
Incredible history, yeah.
It really is. It really, it's astonishing that this guy was the head
and
of
it goes hand in hand with the right wing that was marginalized in the 50s and 60s, and then, boy, the reaction came forward, and boy, did they realize the game was to fund the think tanks. The people who have capital, the people who have money fund the think tanks, and it's in the government, and boy, it changed history, and it's tough history.
Yeah, amazing thing. Alan Minsky, program director with KPFK, and the son of Hyman Minsky. Levy Institute, Levy Institute.org is the gig. Elizabeth Warren just spoke there, and we'll be back. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.